What is the scariest trust your gut feeling you felt before and glad you did so? When I was a teen, I'd make a few bucks helping a local farmer bale hay. The hay would be stacked on a trailer and towed by tractor to the barn. I usually sat on the front of the trailer on the way to the barn, but I suddenly felt like that wasn't a good place to be, and I moved to the back. As soon as I did, I heard a clang. The hitch had come loose from the tractor while heading down a steep hill. I climbed down the back and easily stepped off, moments before the trailer flipped over into a ravine. Story 2. Not me, my grandfather. He used to never wear his seatbelt. One day, he's driving around with my mom and suddenly remarks, "I feel like I'm about to go through the windshield," and buckles in. Less than 30 seconds later, as they're going through an intersection, a car blows the red light going like 40 miles per hour and slams into my grandpa's side of the car. He walked away with nothing worse than some fractured ribs, and now he always wears his seatbelt. Story 3. In the days of MySpace, a girl I knew through high school extracurriculars posted a vague warning about an active duty sailor she met online who seemed normal, but suddenly wouldn't take no for an answer. I messaged her to ask if she was okay, and she told me his name, warning me not to engage with him if he tried to contact me. She then mentioned how she had been deleting some of her pics and profile details because she honestly thought he might try to show up where she worked, or even at our shared after-school activity. Literally the following week, I had shown up for said extracurricular and was in the process of setting up with a few other people. The girl was in the women's restroom down a long, dark, isolated hall, far removed from the primary entryway. Out of nowhere, a guy who looked high schoolish in face and build, and could fit in with us only in that sense, but who I had never seen before, showed up and began looking around as if he knew the place and knew what he was after. I was used to other kids around my age dropping by to visit us out of curiosity, but they would normally just stand around awkwardly until approached. This guy's level of focus struck me as extremely disconcerting, and I couldn't shake this feeling that I needed to tell the girl first and any nearby adult. Because I felt so weirded out, I already knew I didn't want to talk to him, so I looked at the sign and sheet at the entryway. He was the creeper the girl told me about. As soon as I knew that he couldn't take notice of where I was headed, I booked it down the hall toward the women's restroom, where I found the girl and told her what I saw and how I knew it was him. She started crying uncontrollably, and I told her to lock the door and that I was going to tell the adults in charge as soon as I could find them. I then found 2 of the adults and told them what I saw and knew of the situation. The fact that the guy in question was literally just in the other room from us and that the girl had already locked herself in the bathroom. I was only 15. I don't know how I stayed so calm. The adults kicked right into action, escorting the guy off the premises and filing a police report. Story 4. Not sure if it qualifies, but I used to live and work in the suburbs. One evening I was driving home at dusk. I was 18, 19, and had the house to myself. Brother was out of town and mom was at her parents'. My job was about 10 miles from my house and maybe 6 turns on decently sized roads. I'm a fairly observant person, and it wouldn't be odd for the same car to be behind me for half of those turns. But this time, a car followed me all the way to my residential street. I got a gut feeling I was being followed, so I passed my house and turned left. My house was one over from the corner of another residential street that was a quarter-mile loop that also had another small street in it that reconnected to the loop, then back to my street. This car followed me as I made a loop. I then turned right to restart the loop, and it followed me again. This time, I turned down the small street and completed the loop again. It followed me one more time. As I was about to make the loop for the 4th time, they finally drove off. I drove around another 5 mins just to make sure they didn't circle back, as I had nowhere else to park except out front of my house. But I was creeped out the rest of the night. I slept with my door locked and barricaded and with a big kitchen knife. I have no idea if or why they followed me. Don't know if it was a friend pranking me or if my brother put one of his friends up to it, since it's the only time that's ever happened. And it was quite coincidental that I was alone. I worked retail and some of the employees did have records, so I just don't know. Story 5. I thought my son's breathing was weird. He was 4 days old. I couldn't even explain to his doctor what I thought was weird. I just knew it was weird. Took him into the pediatrician and she did a basic look at him. Watched him breathe and said he was fine. I'm just in anxious mommy mode. Yeah, okay. Following day, I take him into the ER, telling them the same thing. I don't know what it is, but his breathing is just weird. And boom, his oxygen was 72. He ended up staying on supplemental oxygen at home for 2 months. I was crying to one of the nurses, and he told me, "Mom instinct is real, and I've seen it save a lot of kids' lives." Story 6. This is my dad's story. My grandfather was old but in good health. Every night, my dad used to call my grandfather, tell him he's coming over, then go and spend an hour talking to my grandfather. One night, he had this feeling he had to go. Just had to go. He called and said he was coming. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But then a series of really unlikely things happened. Walmart registered transaction had some technical issues that took 15 minutes to sort out. Then there was an accident causing more traffic backup that added another delay. Then a third thing that I no longer remember. When my dad finally got to my grandfather had died, as if he had simply fallen over in his bedroom mid-step. My dad, A physician actually wonders to this day, what if he had shown up just 30 or 45 minutes earlier? Story 7. I don't know about Scary, but there was the guy at work that from day one I really didn't like. But for the life of me, I couldn't tell you why. He never did or said anything to elicit this response. I brought up not liking him with coworkers, and they all told me to give him a second chance, etc. And I straight up said no. I was told I was being an asshole. A couple of weeks later, a coworker came up and showed me a news article with mugshots. There's the guy I hate for no reason. He had been arrested for producing drugs. Story 8. Not my feeling, but my mom's a few weeks ago. She works near me and also lives near me, and was going home at lunch to meet a plumber and offered to drive me to my house so I could let my dog out. I normally take the bus to work and then bus home at lunch and back, so the plan was for her to drive me home so I could walk my dog for a bit longer, and then I'd take the bus back. But when we got to my house, she said she thought she better just drive me back to work real quick, it's like 10 minutes, and then go meet the plumber. On our way back, we saw ambulances and police cars going back towards my house. I pulled up the police scanner and we realized there was a shooting at my bus stop at the time I would have been waiting for the bus back to work. Story 9. Not me, but my daughter. We were at a mall and had just arrived at the food court. My daughter, 24, suddenly got agitated and said, "We have to leave. We have to leave now." I thought she was about to get sick and told her to head to the car, that I was going to get her siblings some lunch, and we'd be right out. She looked terrified and said, "No, we have to go now." I had no idea what was wrong, but we quickly went to the car. We were still in the parking lot 10 minutes later, waiting in traffic, when several police cars zoomed in with sirens going. Found out later a gang fight broke out in the food court where we'd just been. A dozen people were arrested. We have absolutely no idea what she picked up on. There was no yelling or angry voices, no groups gathering, no people who appeared to be anything but families getting lunch, but somehow she knew something was about to happen. Story 10. I worked at a bar and had a very friendly gentleman offer to buy me dinner after we had some banter about favorite beer. I was flattered, and he was handsome, but something in me didn't feel that it sat right. Turns out he was a serial killer and killed a backpacker. Grace Mullane, give it a Google, but proceed with caution. Mere weeks later. Police interviewed me to try and find out more of what he had said. He had offered to take a few girls out before he killed Grace. Grace and I were the same age height build. I still have nightmares and survivor's guilt. Story 11. My friend and I were supposed to meet for coffee at Starbucks. I randomly was like, "Do you want to do sushi instead?" So we ate at the sushi place directly across from the Starbucks. While I was waiting for my friend, I heard the gunshot. Someone was shot in Starbucks we were supposed to be at. I literally ran outside looking for her. She just got there in her car, thank God. It was probably a gang shooting, but I would have witnessed it from like 6 feet away had I not listened to the fleeting feeling in my gut. Story 12. Last March, before my father passed away, I called my mom to see if she got a text message I had sent her after not talking to her for almost a year. Something had told me to call her. And when I did, she told me she was on the way to the hospital because my father was at urgent care and had a heart attack while talking to the doctor and another one in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. Later on that night, we found out that he had a heart attack 2 weeks prior, around Valentine's as well, which is weird because around that time, myself as well as my brother started having really bad chest pains, to the point I told my husband I was about to go to the ER and not wait for my appointment a week later. We also found out that he had CHF, a blood clot in his 8 lung and 2 clots in his heart. Sadly, he passed away less than 2 months after finding this all out. After he passed away, his cardio told my mother he had a genetic heart condition that myself and my siblings need to be checked. So I now have the same cardio as my dad, and it's sad going in the office knowing my father was there. Story 13. I had to leave for an appointment, and for some reason, I felt the urge to just sit in my car before leaving. I've sat there just looking around for 2 minutes or so. Then the feeling went away, and I left. When I was on the highway, I saw a crash happen just minutes before I was supposed to be there. Truck blew a tire, hit other cars, which hit other cars as well. It was a mess. 2 people died, a few others heavily injured to the hospital. I was in the traffic behind the scene for about 2 hours, and was so glad I just sat in my car just staring around before leaving. I still do that sometimes, thinking back to that moment. Story 14. I wanted to talk to a professor about an essay I was writing. I knew her office hours were open, just talked to a bunch of friends and had good grades. It was a new term and things were good, even nice weather for fall term. I thought, duck it. I'll just grab a snack from the student store. I walked in, popped open a cup noodles R, not a sponsor, and dispensed hot water in it. As I was paying for it at the counter, a student burst in out of breath, crying and frantic. She said to call the police as there was an active shooter. We hid in the supply closet next to snacks and textbooks, along with at least 6 others. The student explained where it was, and it was a rampage through the same building I was about to go to. My professor was with a student, and I would have been waiting right in the open near where part of the rampage took place. At least 9 died that day, and 1 was someone I grew up with. If it weren't for my gut literally feeling empty, and my mind saying, duck it, I would have had a front row seat to that. Story 15. I've had a few. A coworker in the office next to mine, I just felt one day something was wrong. I asked him if he was okay. He said he was fine. I got him a cookie. He died that night. I'm glad I did something nice for him, and I'm glad I asked how he was. 3 dudes I've met gave me a gut feeling to steer clear. One then brought a gun to school, called in bomb threats, in jail now, may have murdered his girlfriend. Another was caught breaking into women's dorm rooms while they were asleep. I don't believe in ESP. I do believe your brain is gathering a lot of information that you aren't really focused on that can tell you things you might feel as gut instinct. Story 16? About 15 years ago, I lived in a subdivision north of Seattle, and I was out jogging one morning. There were lots of houses and apartment buildings around, but I was coming up to a stretch of road that had some sort of woods on either side of it, which I had jogged through many, many times before. However, on that day, a white van passed me going pretty slowly, and I noticed about 4 blocks up ahead, it had stopped and was just parked on the side of the road. My gut started pinging pretty loudly to not jog on and just turn around and run home, which I did. I'm super glad I did that because I'm almost 100% positive that van was waiting for me. Story 17. So it wasn't my gut, but my friends. I had noticed whenever she had a bad feeling, it almost always turned out to be correct. We were going to sneak out one night and ride in the back of a friend's truck like we did sometimes. She told me she had a bad feeling, and I immediately backed out, and so did she. The others didn't listen, and that night the truck flipped with 2 of our friends in the back. They were both hospitalized for a couple of weeks. One shattered his arm so bad it never fully healed right, and one has full back scars from the road burn. Story 18. My dad, 77, has a sweet tooth. I mean, he hides little treats all over the house. There was a donut shop he used to go to regularly because he has been going there since childhood. One time he took me with him, and the lady that owned the donut shop greeted me. I immediately felt uneasy and literally sick to my stomach. I would not eat any of the donuts my dad had purchased. My dad was very offended I wouldn't eat any. I told him that the woman gave me the heebie-jeebies and was creepy. He laughed it off because more for him, right? Like 5 months later, we found out that she had a basement full of illegal substances. Story 19. One time I got my grandma to the local train station so she could buy a ticket for a future ride. We were in there, and the vibe felt really off. We talked about it and agreed to leave, do some groceries first, and come back later. We came back an hour later, the train station was closed, police everywhere. Someone jumped on the tracks 30 minutes ago and was hit by a high-speed train. Story 20. My grandparents let this one guy stay with them and do some side projects for cash for a few days. When I met him, he made the hair stand up on the back of my neck. He seemed nice on the surface, but he also just felt wrong prawn somehow. Like a year later, he had a multiple-hour standoff with the SWAT team before finally being tear-gassed out and surrendering. So, while I didn't do anything, it's crazy how my intuition knew this guy was bad news. Story 21. IDK if this counts. But in March 2021, I wanted to get teriyaki chicken at a local shopping mall in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, but decided to go to a different mall instead. Around 5 p.m., a fight broke out which led into a shooting at the food court I would have gotten teriyaki chicken at. If I had gone to that mall at that time, I could have been shot. Story 22. I was driving a very remote road in rural Australia. No streetlights, dead straight, pitch black, no other people for 100+ kilometers. It was between Borktown and Julia Creek in far north Queensland. The song Can't Stop by the Red Hot Chili Peppers was playing, and it repeated stop 3 times halfway through the song. I thought, ducking weird for Bluetooth to be messing around after it's been perfect for the last 8 hours of driving. But as I finished that thought, I had a feeling there was something more to it. So I slowed right down. I must have got to about 60 km/h when a herd of donkeys wandered onto the road. Had I been going the 120 kilometers, I would have hit them, no doubt, and very likely been in quite a decent accident. I was going just slow enough to navigate them, and ended up having to swerve onto the side of the road, which is just dirt. Any faster, the car would have skidded and likely rolled. No cell phone signal, and literally no one else around. Every time I hear that song, and particularly where it repeated, I get a wicked shiver and can only think if I hadn't slowed down, it could have been a very poor outcome. Story 23. Felt sick one morning. Borderline, whether it was enough to pull a sickie. I did call in sick. My colleague, who always gave me a lift to work, was involved in a head-on crash with a truck that veered lanes. He survived with minor injuries. The passenger seat was completely crumpled, seat to dashboard. Story 24. One night, back in college, I was the DD and had a car full of people I was driving home. The light turned yellow, and I briefly contemplated punching the gas and going through the light. For some reason I can't explain, I decided not to. The car next to me decided to instead and was T-boned by a semi. Had I run that light, I may have died and killed a car full of people. Story 25. I was in Kandahar, Afghanistan, walking at night using PVS-14 night optical devices. I was walking by myself between one group of soldiers and another a couple hundred meters away, trying to do a nighttime observation kind of deal. I came across a large black rectangle in my night vision. I was thinking this ain't right. A patch of asphalt in the middle of a Haji farmer's field? Why? Part of me just wanted to say screw it and keep walking over it as I stood at the very edge. While new to Afghanistan, it was my first month. I knew one thing. If it looks weird, don't step on it. I must be some kind of genius. Something instinctually told me something was wrong with this 15-foot wide rectangle. I turned on my IR flashlight on my rifle and used it to illuminate the area in front of me. It was a giant hole, 30 feet deep. It was a well. No wall, nothing, just a gaping hole. The funny thing about this discovery is my balance at the edge of this potentially lethal fall, if not deadly, then crippling, became immediately precarious. I was flailing my arms and everything for a second or two. After taking a big step back, I marked the area with IR chem lights, glow sticks that you can only see with night vision, and let everyone know of the hazard. Story 26. This happened when I was 9. My cousin, who was 7 at the time, came over to my house to play, and my dad at the time had to leave the house to buy groceries while my mom was sleeping upstairs. We were told not to leave the house and to just play inside, but being dumbass children, we went outside to play at the playground anyways. The neighborhood was very quiet and empty that day. It was a gloomy and windy cold afternoon, and I think most of the neighborhood was napping. Me and my cousin were enjoying our time in the playground, then suddenly a blue truck pulled up, and the 2 guys inside began staring at us. And at that point, I already slowly packed up our toys and was getting ready to haul ass. I even whispered to my cousin to run with me if anything happens. Then eventually, they got out of the truck, and one of them decided to ask us questions about the neighborhood, and as he was asking, I picked up the last toy and was ready to run when, thankfully, from a distance, I saw my dad pulling up into our neighborhood. My dad immediately stopped on the side of the road and told us to get in the house before the 2 guys could do anything, so we just ran home as quickly as we could. When I finally made it to our garage and got to see my dad, he gave me a totally deserved scolding, and as he was lecturing me, I made eye contact with the 2 guys driving past our house. And for like a week straight, I was paranoid that they would break into our house and kidnap me because they saw where I lived. But nothing happened after that, thankfully. Those guys were definitely kidnappers. I mean, they literally went to our neighborhood for no reason. They just asked about how good the neighborhood is, and when they didn't get what they came for, they immediately left. That conversation was definitely a trap, most likely to gain our trust. During that year, there was a huge spike in kidnappings in my country. There was a girl around the same age as me in a different state who suffered the same fate. But sadly, her kidnapper used brutal force to kidnap her, and she's still missing until this day. This is more of a mixture of my gut feeling telling me to get out of there and the immaculate timing of my dad's arrival. Felt like angels was watching over me that day. Story 27. Not me, but my mom. Back before I was born, her and my dad, I think they were married at the time, but IDK, were headed into California. But mom started freaking the duck out and panicking, and dad listened to her and turned around. The city they were about to drive into had a major earthquake a day or so later. Story 28. When I was about 15, I was walking home after dark with my high school boyfriend. As we crossed an intersection in the neighborhood behind my house, there were 3 guys walking, coming toward us on our left. About 20 seconds after we had passed them, I suddenly had the feeling to look behind us, and I noticed the guys had suddenly disappeared, had never crossed the intersection they had been approaching. When I scanned the area behind us, I saw a guy facing me, who then quickly stepped behind a tree. My boyfriend and I took off fast, cutting through yards, and we made it back to my house. When we peeked out my back door to see if the guys had followed us, we saw them in my neighbor's yard, literally beating the bushes because they clearly thought we were hiding there. I called the cops, and when some old fart cop investigated, he came back to tell me they had found the guys. But they just thought you were pretty and wanted to know where you lived. Yeah, obviously ducking douchebag cop. The cops just let them go because it was innocent. Sure, they were searching for us in the bushes because they just thought I was pretty. Jesus Christ, I'm so glad I looked behind me that night. Story 29. It was in college a couple years ago that I had that trust my gut feeling. One of my buddies had invited me to a house party off campus nearby. Didn't have a car at the time, so I rode my longboard there. Rode up, and the party looked awesome with a whole lot of noise and music, but something just made me want to turn around and go home. Not 10 minutes later did I hear the gunshots. Someone had brought a gun to that house party and shot 4 people. Sadly, 1 died and 3 injured. My buddy had left just as I got there and had no idea what happened, but was okay. Story 30. I was walking home and passed a jeweler's window. I think jewelry is a waste of money, so normally I ignore their display. That day, a ring caught my eye, and I stood for a couple seconds, admiring the design. When I got back in motion, a car shot out onto the pedestrian walkway from the side of the jeweler's building. If I hadn't stopped, the car would have broken my legs and hip and thrown me into the road. Story 31. I got one, but it's not my story, it's my mom's. When she was younger, I think like mid-20s, her friend wanted to set her up with some guy she knew. My mom got a weird feeling about the guy. She didn't know what it was, but she decided not to go on a date with him. Her friends were telling her that she should rethink it and give the guy a chance. He's a great guy. blah, blah, blah. Mom just said, no, I'm good. She said the guy just gave her a weird vibe. Guy's name was Carrie Stainer. Story 32. A couple of times it trusted my gut, and it saved me. Once was in high school, I had started experimenting with drugs, and I really loved it. Still do, actually, just don't partake that often. Anyway, I had a vial with me, around 50 or so doses, and there was a rave that was scheduled for that night. I'd received maybe a dozen calls confirming that I'd be there, and obviously I said yes. As I was about to leave the house, something told me to not go, and I listened. I went back up to my room, turned my cell phone off, and went to sleep. Woke up in the morning to over 200 messages. The narcotics department had showed up at the rave and arrested a lot of people, even for like a joint or two. Had I been caught, my life would have been over. I stopped selling that day and only share with my closest friends. Another incident a few years ago. My girlfriend and I were holidaying in Croatia. A friend of hers had also joined us. They're both really tiny, like 5 feet, maybe 40 kilograms. So I'm always careful when I'm out with them because they just seem like easy targets, especially in new places where I don't know the language. We were in a city called Split and decided to go bar hopping. Met some locals at one of the bars and we were ordering shots. Something told me to randomly keep switching drinks with the girls just in case. Just in case was ducking right, the drinks had been spiked. I'm not sure if they were meant for me or one of the girls, but my girlfriend was done. She can handle her drinks, but this was something else. It took a while to hit her, but by the time it did, we were at another bar. She was totally blackout drunk. Suddenly, I see one of the locals from the bar we were at earlier, and that freaked me out for some reason. He came up to me and said, there's a party at his place, and we should go with him. I'm pretty high, so I was like, okay. As we were heading out, I see these absolute giant guys from the corner of my eye, and it looked like they're following us. I immediately turned to both the girls and told them to go to the restroom in our native language. Then I tell this guy I'll meet him in a second, and I go towards the restroom too. Every single instinct is screaming at me to get everyone out of there and back to our apartment, and I did exactly that. I literally had to carry my girlfriend out of there. We didn't find a cab, but we just kept walking. I have no idea what would have happened had I not listened, but I've come to realize that you don't duck around and find out. Story 33. Friend and I were leaving the Met and decided to get the subway to Grand Central. Rush hour traffic, could not breathe or move for the crowd on that train. Train breaks down at the first stop. The heat and people are making me anxious, so I say, duck it, let's walk. We've been off the subway for about 10 blocks when we see loads of emergency vehicles flying in the direction we came. Friend overhears a cab driver say somebody died on the subway. No idea what killed them, but I wouldn't be surprised if the conditions of the train contributed. I felt seconds away from passing out myself before we decided to get off. Story 34. One evening, I had this sudden urge to study the Heimlich maneuver. Figured I had seen it on TV, but didn't understand the technique and how effective it truly was. A month later, I went to stay at my cousin and his new GF in another city to see a concert. I wake up the next day from the concert hungover AF, and my cousin is at work, and his GF enters the room, panic on her face and grabbing her throat. I jumped out of bed in my boxers, hopped behind my cousin's GF and started doing the maneuver, and after a few pumps, poof, out comes a Advil. She had taken one of those massive gel tabs of Advil and apparently it must have got stuck. Anyway, I was hungover as heck, but having what I learned fresh in my memory depth helped me in that situation. Story 35. My husband and I had recently moved to a new state. We're really into tabletop RPGs and put up a flyer to recruit people for a new game group. One of the apartment maintenance guys came over. When we asked him about experience, it was clear he didn't have any, but claimed he had played one game for years. The game, Ion he said he played, didn't exist. We thought he got something mixed up, but he said he was right. We told him it was okay if he hadn't played before or in a while, but he kept insisting he'd played a game that didn't exist. He didn't seem to be cognitively impaired. We finally just told him we didn't think this was going to work out, but no hard feelings, and maybe later we could try again. He looked mystified, but said okay, and left. A week goes by. My husband's laying down. I'm up with our son. There's a knock at the door. It's the maintenance worker. Talking quickly, he tells me his ride home fell through. He didn't want to walk home in 100-degree heat. He wanted me to drive him home. It wasn't far. He gave me the address. I felt a little uneasy, so I said, hey, let me talk to my husband first. I've got the baby here. The guy seemed to get frantic and said, no, it has to be you. It'll just be a few minutes. Your husband won't even know. You can leave the baby in the playpen. An alarm bell went off in my head. I politely said, I'm not comfortable with that. Please leave. Goodbye. Shut the door in his face, locked it, and woke my husband up. I'm on the spectrum, and I was wondering if I overreacted. My husband made it very clear I had not, that I'd done the right thing left, telling me to lock the door behind me. He looked for the guy, who was nowhere to be found. He went to the front office and told the manager what had just happened. She said, he shouldn't be doing that at all. It doesn't even make sense. His mom just picked him up, and they live at a address completely different from the one he'd told me. So, yeah, I have no idea what would have happened, but nothing good. I got that confirmed several years after we moved away from the place. My husband had me come over to the computer, pulled up to a news site. There was a picture of the guy who'd just been arrested for assault, at our old apartment complex. He'd been using his keys to break into women's apartments and assaulting them. The victims went to the office to complain, and the owners threatened to evict them if they called the police. Finally, one woman said, "The hell with that!" and not only told the police about the assault, she told them about the owner's threats. That scared the crap out of me. I was already sure that he'd wanted to pull something like that, or worse. That day he showed up at the door. I was surprised he hadn't tried the same thing with the keys that he did with the other women. But my husband worked from home. He would never have been completely sure when I'd be alone. He'd also probably realized I'd already told my husband and management about the earlier incident, so he knew I wouldn't be compliant. Story 36. Not my gut feeling, but one I think about a lot. Back in high school, there were two art teachers, O and S. S was the cool one that everyone loved. We could do much more advanced art in his class, and he was genuinely a really great guy. I had him for multiple years, and he was my favorite teacher ever. I was vice president of the art club for him and was asked specifically to be there for his son when he came to the school as a freshman. I was one of few allowed in his room during lunch and before school. I was super close to S, but so were so many other people. Old students that had graduated years ago would come back just to visit him and talk or play chess. I had planned on doing the same thing after I graduated. I liked O too, but for different reasons. I knew his son when we were younger, and I was one of the only students that actually listened to him back when I took his class. It was Art 1. Hardly anyone cared but needed the Art CR. He asked for my help one day to teach a concept to freshmen. So after class, we got to talking about how my classes have been. Talked about the other art teacher and stuff. And he says, "You know, I'm really not one for gossip, but please be careful around him. There's just something not right with him." This caught me extremely off guard. O was the last person in the world I would have expected to talk trash about another teacher, especially to a student, but I took it with a grain of salt. He wouldn't have said something like that unless he really meant it. Well, a few months after I graduate, it turns out that S had been arrested for multiple accounts of coercion. His own daughter, who was in middle school at the time, caught and ratted him out. It is still crazy to me to this day that O was right. It hurts me to my core that I was so close to someone who was actively doing something so disgusting. It really doesn't help that S had left my high school that year to go teach at an elementary school in another part of the state before getting caught by his daughter. A teacher warned me that there was something weird about the cool teacher that I was close with. Story 37. Not me, but my mother has strong mother's intuition. Sometimes I'll ask her before doing something risky how her gut feels. My mom, grandmother, cousin, and cousin's boyfriend went to the beach with me one day. My cousin was so cool to me, aren't they all? And her boyfriend seemed chill. I wanted to ride home with them, but my mom said no because they'd been drinking. When I asked her again, she looked really scared and started yelling, saying, "There is no ducking way you're getting in that car." So I rode home with my mom and grandma. Right behind us, they got in a nasty accident. The boyfriend was in the back seat and ended up upside down in the front passenger seat. The back of the car next to him, exactly where I would have been sitting, was gone, literally ripped from the car and shredded apart. I would have died. Last example is tragic. One of my older cousins has some substance abuse issues. Her and her husband did. They just had a baby, and my mom was one of the first people to see the little boy. Even my aunt, cousin's mother, didn't see the baby yet. My mom took one look at him and saw some things that worried her. She told them both repeatedly to take him to the hospital because something was wrong. They ignored her. The baby died very, very soon after that. At most, 2 weeks later. Story 38. Mile got a new boyfriend. He had so many stories about his wealth and his amazing job as underwater welder. Everybody liked him, but me and the missus could not put a finger on why we did not believe his stories. Until I remember a comment from my wealthy stepfather. "If you are wealthy and drive a really nice car that you had to bring in for repairs, you will not accept a beat-up loaner from the dealer where it is being repaired." He said this because of a similar story a friend of Hike was involved with. The boyfriend drove a horrible car, and it did not make sense at all. Months later, he actually turned up in a nice Mercedes-Benz when he wanted to take us out for dinner. Guess what I learned in the days after? He tricked Mile to stall here. Money from a sale of her house on one of his bank accounts after my research was done. I concluded this man was broke, living with his girlfriend and subscribed to 10 dating sites to trick women to part with their money. Story 39. As a kid, for some reason, I used to like watching and talking to blue-collar workers. One time when I was 7, there was this guy who used to wash cars around our area, and whenever I'd see him while riding my bicycle, I'd stop to see what he's doing and maybe have a word. But one day, he really wanted me to go somewhere with him. IDR. I think it was an invitation to his house. Now I feel really stupid for this, but I reluctantly agreed and went with him. He did kind of pressure me into it with anger, but I was too small to realize. So, as we were riding, we came across a house that I recognized to be the place we lived in a while ago. I told him that, and he seemed hesitant. Somehow, that hesitation was what gave me the red flag, and I snapped out of it and started driving back. As soon as I did that and he noticed, he started yelling out to me. This scared me even more. So I didn't look back and just rode back home safely. I never really met him again. Not that I can remember. This is my speculation, but maybe he stopped working in the area fearing I might tell my parents and inform the cops, and the cops would catch him when he's seen nearby, but you be the judge. But hey, still alive and breathing. I possibly dodged a bullet that day, but who knows? Was a dumb kid for sure. Story 40. My friend started dating this guy, and everyone loved him. Upon meeting him, my gut told me to stay TF away from him, and the few people I told thought I was way off base. Once they've been together a few months, they have a blowout fight and break up. My friend rebounds with her ex the following days, and the guy everyone loved broke into her house, broke into her room, she keeps it locked, and attacked her ex who was next to her in bed. Not much later, they get back together despite his violent return. They're drinking one night, and she goes to pick him up from a party. They fight, leave, and get into a brutal car accident. We're no longer friends, huh? Story 41. I was going home late from my college campus, as I was studying for exams in the library until 8 p.m. By the time I was walking to the bus stop, it was almost 9 p.m. I was waiting at the bus stop I always wait at, and the bus arrives. As the bus pulled in, I noticed that there was only 3 people in the bus. Not super uncommon, especially at this time of night, but the weird thing was that 2 of the 3 passengers were staring right at me without breaking eye contact. When the bus driver opened the door, he too did the same. He didn't say anything to me. He just blankly and coldly stared at me. It was very unnerving. I got a very weird feeling about this entire thing, so I waved him off and told him that I forgot something and needed to go back, and for them to just go on without me. But in response to this, the bus driver immediately chimed in saying, "No, you shouldn't go back. It's late. You can always get that thing tomorrow when you come back. It's quite unsafe out there at this time of night." It felt like the bus driver was trying to coax me into the bus, so I immediately started walking away and telling him, "It's fine." I started walking towards a place I knew there was a security camera and a campus SOS button in case anything happened. After a few seconds of walking, I heard the bus start to leave, and I felt the adrenaline in my body. I waited for another bus at the station, and after about 30 minutes, another one came. But this one was filled with a few more people and looked like a normal bus, so I got home safe. Then a few days later, I heard a news report of a stolen bus from a bus depot and a crew of men who were on said bus kidnapping young adults, mainly college students like me, by pretending to be a bus driver and a couple of passengers, making it seem like a normal bus when it wasn't. As described, the 3 passengers would take care of the victim. They were able to do this quite easily as the bus was in motion when they did their acts, so the victim couldn't easily escape. When I read that story, I was horrified to learn that I could have been one of those victims had I not listened to my gut on that one. I still think about it to this day whenever I enter a bus late at night. Story 42. When I was a teenager, I worked as a bagger at a local grocery store, and one of the job duties was to go out in the parking lot and collect the carts to bring them inside. It was a summer night, and I was the closing bagger. It was pretty quiet in the store, and no one had gotten carts in a while, so I went out to collect them all before the store closed. It was roughly 11:30. So I'm collecting the carts, minding my business, and I notice a large truck idling toward the back of the parking lot. I didn't think much of it. I just figured that someone was waiting for someone else to come out of the store and they wanted to stay in the car. The store I worked at was fairly big and had 2 entrances on either side of the store. Because we didn't have many employees at the end of the night, one side of the store's entry was always closed and locked around 9 p.m., so this side of the parking lot was pretty empty. I moved to the middle of the parking lot after collecting the carts closest to the open doors, and after a few minutes I noticed that the truck I had seen earlier was now in the middle of the parking lot, still toward the back, but had definitely moved and there were fewer cars in this part of the lot. I kept a mental note of it, and reminded myself to keep an eye on the truck to see if it moved again. 5 minutes later, I am now at the far end of the lot, where the doors are closed and no one is parked. Sure enough, the truck had followed me over there, this time not parked at the back, now more in the middle, a lot closer to me. Immediately, I figured out what was likely going on, and I went back into the store, staring at the truck as much as I could to hopefully give them the message that I see them. I know what they're doing. I went inside and told my manager what was happening, and she asked me to come outside with her to point out the vehicle to get a plate number just in case a police report was needed. We go back out into the lot, and the truck is now closer to the open doors. I point at the truck. My manager starts to write the plate number down, and the truck takes off. I'm not entirely sure what was happening that night, but it was in Seatbelt, which is a high trafficking area. I'm really lucky that I was being observant that night. Story 43. I was at the LA County Fair in 2007 when I was 19. Was there with my cousins, and I needed to pee really badly. I left them while they were getting food, and I ran to the restrooms nearby at one of the flower garden exhibits. I must have made a wrong turn when I walked out. I was looking at my phone. When I ended up in some back area, and there was a cop car there. My cousins had texted me to meet them at the colored exit entrance after because we needed to get picked up. I saw the cop in his car. He had his window down. He was a white guy, maybe 25, 30 years old. And I just kind of panicked because I knew we had to leave. So I asked him, "Hey, do you know where this exit is because I'm getting picked up there?" And then he goes, "Are you messing with me? There's no exit or entrance that color." but I was sure of myself that it was the right one, so I told him that, and he told me to come closer to him so he can show me the map. Mind you, I wasn't all the way up to the driver window, so he was kind of showing me for a distance. Then he gestures his hand to come more closer and proceeds to tell me, "Come on, dude, get in the car and I'll show a closer look." In my gut, I knew it didn't sit right with me. His tone and everything just scared the crap out of me, and I was like, oh, actually, you know what? I know where to go now. And I just kind of jogged in the other direction and kind of maneuvered my way back. I started to cry on the way back because I just knew I avoided something really bad happening. I eventually got to the pickup area and met up with my cousins, and I didn't tell them until last year. I've never felt so scared in my life, and at that moment, the reality set in that men are just as vulnerable as women in certain situations. Just sucks that it totally changed my outlook on the police, and I have such bad trust issues because of it. Story 44. A couple of years back, during a tumultuous breakup after attempting and failing to amicably retrieve my stuff, my father and cousin had volunteered to drive me to my ex to fetch my belongings. All was set 6 p.m. straight after work. Angry dad's convoy to this man's gate with a cop to de-escalate just in case someone lost their mind, and I will never forget how upset my father was about the whole situation and how adamant he was in getting my stuff back, even though I was ready to let it go because I felt something was off about it all. Day comes around. 10 minutes before I need to leave the house to drive the angry dads to his gate, Dad walks in calm but visibly unsettled and says, "Let it go. Let him have your things. Let him have his way. This is not worth it. You are worth more than those things." I was so confused and insistent. Old man just said no one is going nowhere. Do not ever go back there. Let it go, move on. Years later, about 3 after the fact, come to casually find out through him over a now deleted, chaotic voice note that he had hacked my phone and knew I would be driving by that afternoon and was leaving the country for uni. And his new girl pretend left him after she found out about me. So he was not that happy about that. So he left work early that day, picked up his dad's gun, loaded it, and was waiting for me to show up, but I never did. And he just, was just kidding. I would never. I asked my dad about why we never went, and he always says he felt a sense of dread in his gut, but he did not know why. Story 45. I wrote this reply to a similar thread about a year ago. I worked a lot in remote areas of West Texas, servicing oil field-related equipment. One time, I was out in the middle of nowhere as usual, and to the northeast was a butte, an isolated hill that's bigger than a regular hill but smaller than a mountain. But everywhere else around was pretty flat. There was one road in and out of the site I was at. At some point when I was working on a control box, I had the overwhelming feeling that I was being watched. I scanned the horizon, looked all around the butte, and went back to work. This happened a few more times within several minutes until I finally saw something move on the side of one of the rock outcroppings on the butte. I went to my truck, grabbed my binoculars, and the figure hid behind that outcropping. It was definitely a human. I glassed him for a good 20 minutes, and I could see him peek around every couple of minutes. Eventually, he leaned out so far that I could see the silhouette of the barrel of a rifle slung around his back. At some point, he was hidden behind his rock for a while, and the next time he peeked out, I couldn't see the rifle. He had either put it down somewhere, or he was now holding it. I immediately felt a sense of impending doom. The hair on my arms and neck was standing straight up. I very quickly collected my tools, got my R-15 from behind the driver's seat and sat it on the passenger seat, and tore out of there. I sped down the dirt road, almost clipped the cattle guard, and started cruising down the highway, just as the adrenaline started to wear off. I remember the metal taste in my mouth, and having to grip the steering wheel to keep my fingers from twitching. A few miles down the road, a maroon Suburban full of guys was pulled over on the oncoming side of the road. They definitely weren't oil field workers. Shades all around, buzzed heads, all intently looking at me. I expected them to pull a U-turn and pursue me, but they didn't. I can't prove that this is what was happening, but I do know that cartel guys run operations where one scouts for guys working alone and calls in a group of guys to rob them of their truck and tools. Story 46. When I was 19, I came home from college. My parents went on vacation for a week and asked me to house sit for them for 2 days. Both of my siblings were also away in other parts of the country. We lived way out in the countryside. We knew all our neighbors, good folk, but the nearest neighbor was almost 1 mile away. On the second night, I got this really strange feeling of uneasiness, which was weird because I grew up in this house and had been home alone many, many times as a teenager. But the feeling that something was going to happen was just incredibly strong. Overwhelming even. So I grabbed one of my dad's rifles and took it to my room upstairs. I loaded the rifle but did not D it. I stood it in the corner next to my bed and went to sleep uneasy. I have never done this before or since. At around 3 a.m., I was awoken by someone in the house walking around downstairs. I heard them walk up the stairs. They came to the platform before my room where there is 2 more steps. At this point, I quietly got out of bed and grabbed the rifle, got behind the bed, and aimed it at the door. I heard them climb those 2 steps to my room. As they started to turn the doorknob, I pulled the spring-loaded action to engage a round, which made a loud, audible click. I saw the doorknob turn back, keeping the door shut, and heard the person bolt down the stairs and run out of the house. After a while, I took the rifle and went room to room, but I knew they were gone. Nothing was missing or stolen. 24 years later, I have no idea who broke into our house and why whoever it was came to my room at 3 a.m. I'm glad whoever it was didn't, because they likely wouldn't be alive. But the weirdest thing was that weird, uneasy feeling I felt the night before. Story 47. Usually, I'm not a believer of that, for all the selection bias is making you forget every time you trusted your gut. But we're wrong doing so because nothing actually happened. However, one time back then in my home country, when the place I lived was kind of very bad, criminality-wise, I waited for my dad to pick me up after a late lesson, next to a roundabout. There was no one around. BMW goes by me with 4 guys. The car slows down without stopping. The 4 guys look at me. Not sure as it was dark, but I somewhat perceived their gaze. I could fight at the time already, but I couldn't have come out unscathed or even worse. While they were taking a turn on the roundabout, I just stepped away and hid, while still watching from afar. The car went by again, slowing down even more to look for me. I'm glad I hid. They would have wrecked me, I think. Second time, I was waiting for the train or subway, minding my own business, listening to music, no environmental awareness. All of a sudden, I get a very bad chill along my spine, like I never felt before. I turn around. There was this guy standing almost right behind me. He could have standed or sat anywhere else. Again, not a ducking soul around. I gave him a surprised, but I acknowledge your presence and I'm watching you look. He looked surprised, but not confused, and took a few steps back, still watching me. A fast train passed by right at that moment. Not sure what his intentions were, but now, when I wait for a train, I stay away from the margin, back against the wall of the deck. Story 48. I have a few, but honestly, the scariest one wasn't actually me. I was babysitting for a couple who were friends of my parents, and the dad was a semi-truck driver. That morning, the mom was crying, and it was honestly very unnerving to me and the dad, since she was a badass smoker mom archetype. She never cried for any reason. I just remember her holding on to him and begging him not to go to work because something felt wrong. When he asked me what he should do, I DK why he did because I was only 19. I told him to trust his wife. I took the kids into their room, and we played games for a while until the dad came in and said we were going out for dinner. So I went with them and handled the kids so they could have a sort of date. That next morning, I get a call from the dad, thanking me over and over. I finally got the story out of him. That morning, his driving partner fell asleep behind the wheel. The father of the kids I babysat would have been sleeping in the back during that shift. But the woman who replaced him for that trip was napping in the front. It saved both their lives. The back of the truck had been absolutely caved in by another trucker since the guy who fell asleep woke up and slammed the brakes to not hit the medium of the highway. I've had some intuition moments and close calls, but nothing has ever touched that. Story 49. I was helping my friend with her move to a new apartment with her fiancé. We worked together, and at the time, she came into my office asking me to go with them to this furniture store, so I said yes. Right before we were leaving, I had this really bad gut feeling. I didn't know what it was, but I was exhausted. So I chalked it up to just that. About an hour later, I was in my living room, on my phone, windows all open, as the electricity was cut off. It's a normal thing in our country. And a huge explosion ripped through the city. I flew off my couch, hit my face on the granite tabletop, and chipped my tooth. I was disoriented for a few minutes when another explosion happened. I looked outside the window. Every single window in every building in my vicinity was shattered to a million pieces. And I started looking for signs of what had happened, and saw a huge cloud from the site of the explosion. And I knew my friend and her fiancé were nearby. The lines were down, people were in a panic, and there were police cars, ambulances, and fire trucks everywhere. They both got badly injured, but thankfully, they made it. Had I gone with them, I probably could have gotten injured too, or died. Thank God I was so exhausted that day, and thank God for the electricity being out, and me having opened the windows otherwise. Glass from the window, which surprisingly didn't break, could have killed me. The other windows all shattered too. Story 50. I lived in one of the poorer areas of a major city, being poor myself. My block was usually fairly peaceful. This story is about the one time in 5 years I lived there when it wasn't. I went out to grab some food from a bodega. There were 2 bodegas close to me. One half a block away, the other one a couple blocks away, in opposite directions from each other. First odd thing was when I stepped outside, nobody else was outside. This was summer, and usually there were a lot of people hanging out in front of the houses. I was going to go to the 2 blocks away bodega because it had better groceries and I figured I could pick some up while I was getting food. I turned to walk toward it and noticed a group of people I didn't recognize on the corner. 3 or 4 guys. I immediately just decided to go to the closer one instead. It wasn't even a fully conscious decision. Everything just felt weird. As I was entering the bodega, gunshots rang out from down the block. 2 people were shot. 1 died. Would have happened right as I approached that intersection. Story 51. Me and my friends were teenagers at a park in Luxembourg on a hot summer day, smoking joints and drinking some beers. Some random dudes Also teens, a little older, but not by too much, came and asked if we wanted some of what they were drinking. This was very common. It's a small country and everyone knows each other and the crime rate is relatively chill. But I said no, and I told my best friend not to as well. They had a disgusting aura to them. Some other friends in the group did take some sips, and I begged my best friend not to again before heading a few meters away to bum a cigarette off of someone sitting in the grass next to us. When I came back, I saw my best friend take a sip of the Malibu coconut bottle. I told her we needed to leave immediately. I just knew there was drugs in there. There was absolutely no doubt in my mind for some reason. My other friends said I was overreacting, and I angrily grabbed my best friend and said we were rushing to the nearest Quick, Belgian version of McDonald's. By the time we got close to the Quick, her feet were dragging, and her words were slurring, and I was literally pulling her to the establishment. I called her mother from the Quick bathrooms and told her everything, as my best friend was lying on the toilet floor almost paralyzed. It all gore sorted out, and she was fine in the end, thankfully. I know this seems obvious now, but on a summer day as a carefree, punky teenager who shares drinks with the whole group and doesn't see consequences, that instant just struck me as particularly dangerous and stood out to me as weird even then, as soon as it was happening. I'm so happy I dragged my best friend out of there. We are both adults now. Safe to say we do not accept drinks from random anyones anymore. Story 52. My wife and I went Black Friday shopping in 2018. She was 9 months pregnant. When we walked into the mall, I told her I felt uneasy and told her we need to get in and out pretty quick. She wanted to go to look at some running shoes at Foot Locker, and I told her I didn't feel that was good because it was upstairs. So we went to a store on the lower level instead. A fight broke out outside of Foot Locker that ended with 1 dead and a few wounded. We had just walked away from the escalator to another store on the lower level and were able to exit before being trampled by the ensuing chaos, and were able to get home safely. Story 53. When I worked at Walmart, there was a night that a man was following me around the store. I asked him politely if he needed help. He said no, and continued to hang around me. It creeped me out, so I called my husband and told him instead of sitting in the car waiting for me to come out, I needed him to come into the store. He did this, and as we were walking out, the guy was waiting outside for me. Later in the week, he did the same thing to a coworker. Only when she went to leave, he grabbed her arm and tried to pull her to his car. I'm so glad that I trusted my gut that he was dangerous. My mom and aunts always told me growing up to listen to that gut instinct when it came to a man. That advice has saved me more times than I could count. Story 54. Not me, but my mom. When she started semi-truck driving like 20 years ago, she started by taking an orange and white cat named Little Boy with her. He was an amazing companion over the 17 years he was alive. Gave her companionship on the lonely roads, kept her motivated and laughing, and also protected her. Little Boy was a very friendly cat overall, so for most people who approached her truck, he was very chill, except for this one guy. My mom saw him approaching and got a bit of a weird feeling. My mom is a petite and short woman for the industry, so she knows she can be a target. When he came up and said hello, Little Boy got very upset. Poofy, spitting, grumbling, etc. My mom was shocked, but believed her cat and her gut feeling. She politely talked to him about whatever he needed, and he asked if he could come check out her truck after making a joke about also having a grumpy cat. She declined and said she was busy before heading for another truck stop. Turns out, that guy was going around mugging and assaulting people. She's never had another experience quite like that in the trucking industry, but her cat taught her to believe her gut instincts on people. And to this day, she still follows that. Little Boy maybe acted like that 5, 10 more times, but each time my mom also had the gut feeling. Trust your pets if they don't like someone. Story 55. We were dumb teenagers in a van running from cops. My friend was driving and she pulled into an alley and we were booking down it. I got a weird feeling and screamed out, "Stop!" She slammed on the brakes. We stopped, killed the lights, and peeked watching as the cop car blew past us back out on the road. We got out and realized we had almost slammed into a loading dock. I'd been feeling the decline through my adrenaline, and my mind put it together before I even consciously realized why there would be a decline. Story 56. My friend moved to a different state and got an apartment there. She's very outgoing, but also a bit naive. She befriended the complex's maintenance guy, told me on a phone call that he had been showing her how to fix things at her request. I worried to myself that he might get ideas about her and think she was interested in him romantically if she kept being friendly with him, but I didn't say anything. A month or two later, she calls me in tears because he had broke into her apartment. I wish I had warned her about my fears, but I didn't. Trust your gut and tell your friends if something feels off. Story 57. I was in 3rd grade. At school one day, a tornado comes through. I'm on all fours with my hands behind my head, which is against a wall. Above my head is a fire extinguisher, vibrating against the wall. I tell a teacher and get yelled at that. If I move again, I'm going to the principal after the tornado warning and my mom would be called. I tried to scoot over a little. Same teacher yells at me, and a second teacher joined in with the first teacher. Not even 1 minute later, I'm convinced I can feel the fire extinguisher slamming into the wall. so I think it's worth a trip to the principal. I move. Power goes out. The glass doors get smashed in by branches. Everyone is screaming and hear the loudest thud I've ever heard before or since right next to my head. Then I see stars. The fire extinguisher fell off the wall and hit my head. If I hadn't moved, it would have come down directly on the back of my head. Because I moved, it hit the floor, then fell sideways into the side of my head. I had a huge knot on the side of my head, and a bruise that started under my hair and went across part of my face. They gave me an ice pack and said I was fine. I told my mom, and she took me to the hospital to check for a concussion 5 hours later. My dad drove to the school, an almost 2-hour drive for him, to rip the principal and 2 teachers a new one. To this day, there's a handful of pictures of me in 3rd grade with a huge bruise covering part of my face. Goes great with the pictures of me in kindergarten with 2 missing front teeth. Story 58. I used to explore abandonments. One day it was unseasonably warm for January. Nearly t-shirt weather. I'd gone for a drive through the country by myself, just to enjoy the sunshine, and at one point came across what used to be a summer resort house in the woods. To access it, I had to park down the road and hike in. I entered through a window in a living room type space, and then wandered around. The layout was kind of winding with a lot of short corridors and connecting small rooms, like a kitchen with 2 doors connecting to hall, utility sink room, pantry, etc. The place was in major disrepair. After finishing the 1st floor, I went up to the 2nd floor. I had only just started wandering that level when I came towards a room and sensed something really dark about it. I just had that feeling that it was time to get out. I also realized I'd been really foolish on this, as nobody knew where I was. My car was far off. I had 0 gear, self-protection, etc. I started downstairs at a pretty brisk pace. Downstairs, while heading toward the exit, I glanced down at the floor. It had a film of condensation on it from the wild temperature changes. I could see my fresh footprints in the moisture from where I'd been previously. I also saw a 2nd pair of footprints coming out from a room and following mine. Honestly, that was one of the last times I explored abandonments. I had a hard time recruiting friends to join me, and it was just too insane to keep doing it solo. Story 59. Was at a mall with my mom, and we were heading out, when all of a sudden, some people that worked for a travel agency asked us to participate in a game of sorts. We did. They were basically scratch cards that contained prizes, or nothing at all. They gave my mom one, and she didn't win anything. They asked me to select one from a bunch, and I won the best prize, which was a trip to 5 different destinations, full expenses paid. My mom couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. They asked me to fill a form, and what weirded me out was that I had to claim the award at their office. The office was across the parking lot and in the basement of the mall, and for some reason that weirded me out and gave me weird vibes, added to the fact that they were Colombian. We were walking in the parking lot and checked their website out. I'm a software developer, and when I looked at the domain name as well as the overall design, it gave me even weirder vibes. Just before exiting the parking lot, I said to my mom, "This gives me weird vibes. Let's get out of here." The dude was flabbergasted and we left. Turns out it was a scam. When you arrive at their office, they make you sign some do ejaculate or cum seminence, and they immediately charge you $700, $800 to your CR card. A friend's friend fell for that and had to pay. That day, I just closed my eyes and thanked God for not only giving me that eerie feeling, but also for making me a very pessimistic person. Story 60. As a kid, I met this very distant relative at a large family gathering. I was maybe 13 and he was like 19. He seemed very, very keen to hang out with me, and it was kind of just weird. I got along with him first time we spoke, but I didn't have any burning urge to hang out. I brushed his suggestion to hang out aside. He, however, started getting more persistent. He showed up at my family's holiday home in that same town to wait for me to wake up for when we'd be hanging out, something he'd decided. I woke up to see this guy in my room watching me sleep. I found an excuse and didn't go hang out with him. I started telling my mother, siblings, and closer relatives that I was very uncomfortable with hanging out with him. Most took my side on this. He showed up more times and we had excuses each time. It got to the point that I could hardly go outdoors without this guy somehow finding me and trying to pressure me into hanging out. Eventually, my young and cool auntie started telling him off, and she also spoke to his parents. My grandfather, who is a big name in that town, also intervened. The creep went away after that. I don't know what the hell this guy wanted, but it wasn't good. Gave me major creepy vibes. Story 61. In my business, I used to export precious minerals through a shipping company. They do it for relatively low costs and used to be highly efficient. I had my personal stock of around $100K and consigned stock for around $500K. I used to export through this company bi-weekly, and last year, September, I said myself something doesn't seem right and switched to another agent. 2 weeks later, I hear that the previous agent was caught gravely undervaluing the minerals and got all the minerals of their other clients confiscated by the customs. Thankfully, trusting my gut, I avoided a huge loss. Story 62. I actually have a story for this question. I was 15 and was at the annual Royal Adelaide Show. I'll preface by saying I'm a thrill seeker. Any thrill ride, adventure, anything. I will go on. My sister asked me to go on this particular ride with her and something in me told me no. She pleaded with me for so long and I wouldn't go. I couldn't explain it, but I got a bad feeling and refused. No rhyme or reason why. My sister went on and nothing happened. I felt kind of stupid. A few days later, a girl was flung from this ride and died. Story 63. Back when I was working in a prison, I did my round in 24 building Abbey Pod, which was all max and had this weird feeling in my gut that I needed to do an X-Bite Ed round, aka fast walk. About 4 minutes later, the building lost power, and the automatic fire safety system glitches and opened every single door in the building. Me and my partner barely managed to get the main doors to each pod shut, and then waited in the control tower while every pod but one went full riot mode. They called insert from around the state, and we got CM tear gas the building from the ceiling. Had to shut down a full wind at the hospital for all the inmates that were hurt from other inmates settling petty grudges. Story 64. I always told my daughter to trust her gut. She had a friend in elementary school, 4th or 5th grade. We were sort of friends with the family too, so knew them pretty well. My daughter is invited to spend the night with her friend one night and comes home and all is good until she gets invited to spend the night again and says she doesn't want to spend the night there again. I ask why she says the dad gave her the creeps. I start to ask all the questions like, did he do anything to her, touch her, take her in a room alone, show her anything? She answers no to everything and just said he was creepy. I asked her if she wanted her friend to sleep over here and she said no. I didn't push her on this, but would occasionally ask her questions over the next few weeks to get any ideas if anything inappropriate happened. But nothing happened. We stopped hanging out with them, but not for that reason, just a busy life with 4 kids. Fast forward 5 years, and the dad is arrested for child molesting, and the wife divorced him. My daughter and I have talked about this incident many times, and she always thanks me for listening to her, and I always tell her it's because I couldn't not listen to her when I taught her to trust her gut. If I forced this friendship, then I was teaching her not to trust her gut, and I didn't want to do that, so I trusted her gut. Story 65. Back in 09, I was living with an aunt and uncle. The uncle had some anger issues, but I was assured he was doing well and not drinking anymore. And I was desperate to finish my degree, but too poor to afford housing. So I agreed to take my chances for the last few months of my degree. Things were fine for a while, and I was keeping to myself, being through with school crap and whatnot, and trying to not rock the boat. I was constantly worried that this bout of calm was an exception, not a rule. I'd heard my aunt crying a few days previous, and while I couldn't make out the cause, alarm bells were going off in my head that my uncle was back on his schmidt. I mentioned my bad feeling to my parents, and they urged me to just stick it out for a week or so more, and then maybe by then they could help get me living space somewhere else. A few weeks later, I come home and the house is silent. I didn't think too much about it and head to my room. I was on the phone to my boyfriend at the time and just suddenly felt the overwhelming urge to lock my door ASAP. As soon as the door hit the latch, my uncle was shouldering into it out of nowhere, absolutely blind drunk and in a full rage. I got the door locked in the absolute last second and ended up jumping from a window to escape the house. Uncle has since been in and out of jail for violent assault. I'm extremely thankful that my brain urged me to get that door locked when it did. Story 66. I was walking home after getting the last bus. One part of the sidewalk went through a wooded area. It was a nice suburb, well lit, but I didn't like walking through that part, so would walk in the road. This particular night, I got super freaked out, and everything in me told me to run past on the opposite side of the road. So I did all the way to the next house, and I ran up their driveway. I stood a while to catch my breath, hidden in the shadows, and just as I was about to start walking, berating myself for being paranoid, 2 men stepped out of the wooded area. Story 67. I was 4 or 5, 1987-ish, San Pedro K, sitting on the sidewalk on the corner of my block, daydreamily watching the clouds. I had a wooden walking stick with me that made me feel like a real adventurer. Even though I was only 3 houses away from home, a white van came to a stop at the sign next to me, and I was still very much focused on the clouds. But my whole body went electric with alarm. To this day, I have never experienced a gut alarm so acutely jarring and memorable. I sat up and turned toward the van. The driver's door opened and a hairy leg emerged. When his shoe touched the ground, I jumped up and ran, left my precious cane rattling on the sidewalk, and everything felt slow motion. In my left ear, I heard the van making a U-turn and coming up behind me. I started yelling, "Help! Help!" My dad was vacuuming the inside of our green VW camper in the driveway, so I don't think he heard me. But I ran across the grass and jumped onto him. He still remembers this, since we weren't a particularly hug-out-of-nowhere family. And I heard that van speed off up the hill. My dad's side of the family is pretty sensitive. I have hot tempers, worrywarts, addictive tendencies, and some days I really struggle with carrying those genes. I feel the world intensely, both when things are beautiful and when they're crap. But every time I remember this story, I get this wash of gratefulness for the sensitive man I am, and the sensitive little dude I was. At least once, it definitely saved my life. Story 68. My dad was going to drive my older sister to the mall for her job. I often went with and just wandered the mall while she worked. He asked if I wanted to go this time, and I said sure. I went and got ready, and while checking my outfit in the mirror, I just did not like my outfit despite wearing it many times before. My sister was getting impatient, and I thought maybe because I couldn't pick what to wear, it wasn't meant to be, and I'd have some alone time at home. They left. About 2 hours later, I'm worried because my dad was just going to drop her off and come home. My mom worked down the street from the mall, and she was going to bring her home. This was 1992. Or 1993, so no cell phones. I called my mom, and she hadn't heard from them. Then the store called to see where my sister was. 10 minutes later, my dad called to say their car had been cut in half by another car that ran a red light. They were driving up a US highway, so going like 55, and this person cut the back half of the car clean off. They were both unharmed, except some minor bruises and scratches. I was the younger sister, so I would have been in the back seat and probably killed because that was where the impact was. So the moral of the story is, if you don't like your outfit, it's a sign to stay home. Story 69. Pretty much every time my spider senses have gone off at work, it's been right. Radio silence, lack of feedback, upper management more distant and unavailable than usual. Probably layoffs incoming, I said. Dismissed as negative and paranoid and made to feel like I was some kind of moron. Weeks later, layoffs. I've handed notices in because I sensed bad things like that or crunch mandates incoming, or because I felt like I was covertly being bullied, or that I felt the company was about to collapse. And every single time it's confirmed, my gut instinct was 100% correct. It cannot be understated how socially aware people have Spidey levels of gut instinct superpowers when it comes to psychopathic corporate environments. They've helped me backflip over a few flying knives heading straight for my back. Story 70. Not me, but my mom. When I was 21, she was getting divorced from my stepdad. It was to the point she would not stay alone. I was the one who drove her around. There was another family that was staying at our house, just so my stepdad wouldn't bother her. One day I had decided I was going to stay home, but she insisted that I go to my dad's place to finish packing up things I had there. I agreed and went to my dad's. She ended up driving herself to work, which was unusual. About an hour after I got to my dad's, I got a shocking phone call. My stepdad had stopped by our house and left a letter for my mom. One of the other family members took the letter, and he told the lady goodbye. He then proceeded to go to our driveway and die. They were divorcing because he had gotten really bad into drugs, had quit his job, and refused to work. He tried multiple times to get disability payments, but he was rejected each time. It was discovered that he had basically gone on a drug binge shortly before he died. The autopsy report showed multiple illegal substances in his system. I'm still fully convinced that if I had stayed home, he would have killed me just to hurt my mom. That was 24 years ago, and to this day, I am forever grateful for her insistence that I not stay home. Story 71. This is a combination of my gut and those of several small children. I used to work in a private Catholic prep school, and the school chaplain was a retired monk. When I was on evening duty and responsible for monitoring the boarders' bedtime routine, I started noticing that the chaplain would always walk very slowly past the showers when the boys were using them. There was no actual reason for him to be in that part of the building either. The bedtime routine was not part of his remit. I also noticed that the youngest boys were getting changed into their pajamas under their duvets if the chaplain was about, and I'd be willing to bet that if I'd asked them why they were doing this, they couldn't have told me. I reported my concerns, and a short while later, the chaplain had been replaced. Would love to hope that he'd been retired permanently, but knowing the Catholic Church's way of handling kiddie fiddlers in the clergy, the guy was probably moved on to another school. Story 72. I've got one. We had recently moved to another state. I was 12, and my sister was 4. I was watching TV, my mother was taking a nap, and my sister was outside in the back fenced yard playing in her sandbox. Out of nowhere, I heard, "Go check your sister," in my head. Or maybe it was a thought, I don't know. I glanced to the big windows, but couldn't see the yard from where I was sitting. I brushed it off. I felt, or heard it again, much more urgently. I jumped up, went outside, and she wasn't there. I ran around to the fence gate, and it was open. I ran to the front, calling for her. I got all the way to the end of the driveway, calling her, and honest to God, I saw the back of her. She was walking hand in hand with some man and just trying the corner. A second later, and I wouldn't have seen her at all. I screamed her name, but was frozen in place. She let go of the man's hand and came to me. She said the man had gone into the backyard and asked him to help him find his dog. It was terrifying. I took her inside and immediately woke my mom. I don't recall that she called the police, and I have no idea why she didn't. I'll never forget it. Story 73. Walking home from a party in a different country. I passed on the other side of the street, a bar. I saw a man nudge his friend, and both looked back at me. Something set off my sketch meter, and sure enough, I saw them cross the road to walk behind me, but a bit back. I turned a corner and crossed a street, and whilst looking for traffic, saw they were still there. Knowing around the next turn was a more dimly street with very few people on it, I had to do something. As soon as I turned the corner, I bolted, so glad I was wearing flats, and ran under someone's garden arch that had a thick hedge near it. Basically hiding in this shrubbery, I could see the men turn the corner, stop at the now empty-looking street, say something to each other, then turn and leave. Story 74. I used to go to a very small gym in a strip mall in a small town where members could come and go at any time with a key code. There were never any employees attending it or anything, although there were cameras and cleaners that came by sometimes. I got there around 8 in the evening, so it was dark, but not really late, and there was a guy already in there lifting weights. I noticed another guy walking around outside on the phone or something. The weightlifter left shortly into my workout. The man from outside came in. He didn't put in a code. I'd never seen him there before. He was wearing a polo shirt, jeans, loafers, and a baseball hat. Super casual, but not dressed for the gym at all. He started messing around on a treadmill, but he didn't look like he knew what he was doing with it. My gut said run. We're alone and he's not here to work out. I booked it to my car and got out of that parking lot before I even had time to put on my seatbelt or anything. I honestly don't know what his intentions were, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. Might have been rude, but I'm not about to be on Dateline. Story 75. My dog has been around for damn near a decade now. She is the goodest girl. She loves everyone and everything the second she sniffs them. Bark like a banshee until you walk in, and once she sniffs you, it's like a switch flips and you're her best friend. Well, when she was 3 or so, I met a new neighbor. He came in to drop something off, and we were small talking about pickup soccer we'd been playing, and my doggo came around the corner, saw him, barked, approached, sniffed, and backed away slowly while peeing super weird. Guy was really nice. Been playing with his group for a while. Our kiddos played together, wives liked each other, and talked across the alley. And he was a literal pastor and youth group leader whose former charges were part of said soccer group as they aged out. He was pretty severely bipolar and was diagnosed right before the news broke of his infidelity. Before realizing the scope and scale of what was going on, my doggo called it, and she's literally never done that again with anyone else. Story 76. Middle school teacher everyone loved. Super chill. Played hip music before after school so kids could hang in his classroom, gave speeches at graduation, etc. I hated being in his class. There was always something off about him, and no one understood why I never engaged with him. First year in high school, we get an automated phone call from the district. Mans was arrested during after-school hours for trying to meet with an underage boy. Actually was an undercover FBI agent. Still, so many kids' parents defending him until people started putting 2 and 2 together. He would always favor the boys in class. He was the basketball coach that had full view access in the boys' locker rooms. He would give boys tokens and stuffed animals. I always somehow knew deep down that was something wrong with him. Story 77. Not me, but someone I know. Their newborn child has been struggling with eating, breathing, and sleeping. The baby's only able to eat while it's napping and not while awake. The way it breathes kind of clogged as well. They've been to clinics and doctors, but their reason is baby is still young, still developing. It will heal in no time. Months passed when it got worse because the baby went underweight and almost no sleep. The mother, as a mother she is, her instincts kicked in and asked the hospital to do an X-ray of the baby's lungs. It was then, at that time, that they found out that the problem is the size of the baby's heart, since the X-ray of the lungs showed the shape of the heart. They immediately scheduled an operation. Baby's first year was celebrated in the hospital. Dang, we were so mad at all of them. Seriously wanted to sue them. But the government is luckily providing them financially due to the baby's health issues. Baby is a healthy little girl now. If not for the mother's will to let her lung be checked, we don't know what would have happened. A reason I do not fully trust doctors. I don't hate them. I am just not fully convinced to all their findings. Story 78 was at my house with my best friend when I was about 16 or 17. I grew up with a single mom BPD, schizophrenia. You could guess I had an interesting childhood. Me and my friend were hanging out in the living room, and I noticed my mom hadn't come out of her room for hours and didn't text me or tell us to be quiet, so I walked in her room. She was sitting up against her headboard, mouth open, eyes closed. Just didn't look right, so I tried to wake her up, and she did wake, but was very much not herself, and just seemed really slow. My mom is older than all of my friend's parents, so she had health problems. I talked to my friend, both of us going back and forth on calling 911 or just letting her sleep it off. I decided to trust my gut and call a 911. Turns out she took a whole bottle of Xanax and fully planned on not waking up the next day. Fire department said I was lucky to have found her when I did. She took 20-something Xanax. I'm glad my mom is still alive and a kick-ass grandma to my son. Story 79. My friend's mom. In high school, a group of us decided to go to the beach. My friend would drive the van with 7 people, and I'd drive my sports car. Right before we left, my friend's mom decided she didn't want her son to drive because the van registration hadn't been renewed, plus a few other things. I decided I was going to go anyways, while my friend was busy arguing with mom. Right as I was about to leave, mom said, "I don't know why, but you can drive the van. I feel like y'all need to go to the beach." While we were there, was a cloudy, colder day, so it was basically our group and other group. A teen and his cousins in the other group dug a tunnel in the sand, and it collapses on the teen. We helped dig him out, call 911, and get him breathing again. saving his life. If we hadn't have gone to the beach, he wouldn't have made it. According to the DR, even with 5 of us digging, he had another 30 seconds or less before permanent brain damage or death had occurred. Even if I had gone by myself plus one friend, he wouldn't have made it. Story 80. When I was 16, I was out walking when a car pulled out of a driveway I was walking past and very slowly drove by me before turning right off the main road and into a subdivision. The car stood out because it was making a sort of putt-putt-putt noise. The street I was walking on is residential, but there is a section that opens up with a golf course on one side and empty fields on the other. I had walked beyond the residential section and was slowly coming up on the golf course when I heard a recently familiar putt-putt-putt. Keeping to a crawl behind me was the car that had driven by me earlier. I turned to look at them several times, but I couldn't see the driver. They never acknowledged me and continued to drive slowly enough that they remained behind me while I walked. The golf course was probably another 10 minutes away, and I was increasingly freaked out, so I turned around and booked it back to the populated section of the street. The car didn't follow, thankfully. Story 81. I was on a first date with a really pretty girl. At some point, she started to subtly make it very clear she wanted me to go home with her for a good time. I was still a virgin at the time, a very horny 18-year-old who really wanted to get laid. Yet despite that and how hot she was, something inside me screamed, I shouldn't go with her, to which I thankfully listened, did my best to politely decline her, saying it was too fast for me. She seemed really insulted by my rejection and didn't date me any further. I still had her on Facebook, though. 3 months later, she posted an announcement on her Facebook, a picture of herself and her girlfriend, along with the text, pregnant. We're getting a baby. Out of curiosity, I went to the comments and saw messages of a furious guy along the lines of, WTF? Sabotaged our condoms to get pregnant? You're a f***ing psycho. Still so freaking happy I've dodged that bullet. Story 82. When I refused to go with an ex-boyfriend to his house to watch a boxing match. He kept insisting that I go, and I asked him who was going to be at his house, and he said all of his male friends. I asked him were they bringing their girlfriends, and he said no. When I told him I was not going to his house with him, he got mad and walked away and left me on a dark corner in the bad part of New York City. I was very glad that I did not go something. Just told me in my gut this is not going to bode well for you, girl. Story 83. I am a safety person. I never drive and talk on phone or text. Always wear a seatbelt. I am the quintessential definition of driver safety. So on a day, I got the beep alert message of a text while sitting at traffic lights that had just gone green. Something which I never do nor have done since looked at the message, and it was inconsequential. But when I looked up, a taxi, stolen, drove at great speed through the red light, and if I didn't look down to my phone for the message, I would have collected and most likely killed me. Story 84. A guy that I worked with at the same store but different department seemed off, always smiling but in the dead behind the eyes kind of way. We assumed he was on Prozac or heavily medicated. His GF worked with him and she didn't seem as off, but maybe standing next to him, bat crap crazy, seemed like the closer one to normal. At some point they started inviting me out for drinks all the time and for the silliest or slightest of reasons. Just them two and me, never anyone else. Even if I was standing next to someone when they invited me out, I kept declining and never went out with them, because that was too much crazy for me to handle times two. I could never get over the uneasy feeling his glazed over eyes gave me. At some point, they got engaged and invited me out one last time for drinks to celebrate. Again, just me and them. I declined and went on about my life. Fast forward Google Dan Wozniak. Story 85. My husband and I were coming home from our honeymoon, driving. Long trip, like over 12 hours. We get most of the way home and all of a sudden traffic comes to a dead halt out of nowhere. We stopped in time, but the people behind us didn't. Lots of accidents happening all around us too. We pull to the shoulder and start asking everybody if they're okay, calling the police and all that fun stuff. After about a half hour of being stuck on the side of the road, I get this feeling like I should be behind the guardrail, and so I do. Sure enough, not even 5 minutes later, an 18-wheeler jackknives and hits the guardrail just beyond our vehicle and plows into many cars. I likely wasn't going to get injured where I was to begin with, but after that, I made my husband wait with me behind the rails just in case. It was super ducking scary. Story 86. My wife's grandmother was around 80, but still very active. One morning, my wife called her father, out of state, about something. He mentioned he'd talked to his mom that morning and she was a little manic. My wife hung up and looked at me and said, I have to go see grandmother. I was getting ready to leave for work and found myself saying, I'll go with you. No idea why, but I took a PD and we went to grandmother's. She was very excited and chatty about going to an off-Broadway show. A little too excited. Then she started acting odd and had trouble moving. We called for medical. It was assisted living. When the medics got there, she started arguing with them. She was fine. She was going to a show. She died right in front of us. Story 87. Maybe not the scariest, but after uni, some colleagues got in touch with me about a job offer further up north. It was for a head honcho position at a startup in a field that is not easy to get into or progress in. I was still looking for work in my field at the time. It would have been the perfect start to my career, but my gut feeling told me no. Also, I'd have to leave everything behind, which felt like a very risky and insecure move, so I declined the offer. A few months later, I checked up on them. They said they were screwed over by the owner and they're out of a few £1,000s each in wages. The guy just disappeared one day and didn't even attend the court hearing. Years later, they've still not recovered the money. Started their own company. I was not given an invitation. I suspect they were butthurt that I listened to my gut and didn't go down like they did. And I found work in a different field that I enjoy much more. Story 88. My now wife and I lived in Vegas for a little while, but weren't really digging our jobs and missed living close to family. So we decided to leave Vegas and move back home. We loved drinking and visiting the Strip. So after packing, we were strongly considering hitting the Strip for a little while just to have some fun for our last night there. We decided not to. And my wife was saying, hey, I don't want anything bad to happen right before we leave. That was October 1st, 2017, the night of the deadliest mass shooting at the time in the United States. Story 89. I went on a hiking trip around Iceland with my best friend after finishing school tickets directly to Iceland. We're crazy expensive, but there was a cheaper option. We booked flights to New York via Iceland, with the option to stay in Iceland for 4 weeks, and then just do 3 days in New York. So after our hiking trip was finished, my friend had a super bad feeling about going to New York. So bad that she begged her parents to send us money for a direct flights home, and we did well. That was in September 2001. Story 90. Wife and I walking along a deserted road at night in North Thailand. A man on a scooter appeared alongside us and approached. He gestured at his bike and said, "No gas, 100 baht." I felt something really off. Placed myself between him and my wife, sort of squared up. He repeated his request. At that moment, 2 large dogs rocketed out of the shadows toward us, barking. The man on the scooter took off. The dogs milled around. We found them again the next morning and gave them dog treats from 7-Eleven. We walked the rest of the way to our resort hotel. Strangely, a cat also appeared immediately after and accompanied us all the way back to our villa. It was like the animals felt something as well. I've stayed in Chiang Mai a lot and have local friends. They all think something strange was in the air that night, as locals don't tend to behave like that. Story 91. Just out for a walk in the neighborhood, and this guy immediately caught my attention. Walked weird. Acted overly casual. I went last minute into a street to see if he would follow, and he did. He was going a different way and changed his direction when I changed mine suddenly. Luckily, there were 2 more random people on said street. I walked a bit faster to catch up to them. The street ended on a busier street, and he then went back the way he came from. We're talking Saturday mid-morning. I was with my baby son. Maybe it was nothing, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. Story 92. I woke up one morning with this feeling of doom, but with a drive to get supplies. I went to the store for batteries, canned goods, bottled water, and various snacks. When I got home, I checked the other supplies and the gas turnoff wrench. I felt a little better, but the heavy doom feeling remained. I had a meeting at 8 a.m. the next day with out-of-town corporate people, and I was not going to be late. I woke up at 4:15 and was making oatmeal and coffee when I heard a noise like a train coming through our backyard. Then I felt a mild shake, followed by feeling like I was being tossed into the air. The date was January 17th, 1994, the day of the 6.7 Northridge earthquake. Meeting canceled. The corporate people immediately went to Lax for flights back to Boston. Story 93. I remember this one time I was hiking with a friend in the woods. From the point of actually getting into the woods, I had this sort of eerie feeling in my gut, as if something was just off. Shrugged it off for a bit, kept going. After going about a mile, 1.5 miles, we stumbled upon a creepy old cabin hidden behind the trees. We wanted to get closer to see what's out there, but then of course, fear overtook our desire to explore, got the hell out of there. A week later, my father told me that he'd found a body inside the cabin. Thank to Jesus Christ in our guts. Story 94. Lived in a house with my parents, sister, grandparents, aunt and uncle. My uncle always gave me a weird vibe. I was about 5 when I started living there, and I always refused to say hi to him or hug him or just be near him. He never did anything to me or said anything strange. I always got called rude by my parents, and I got accused of being badly raised. Around at 11 years old, we moved to a different state altogether to live with just my parents and my sister. Turns out we had to move because my uncle was molesting my sister. Story 95. Most standout one for me is being maybe 7 or 8 and walking my dog with a friend. Bright sunny day, but getting progressively windier and windier. Lived in an area dominated by trees along roads and footpaths. When all of a sudden I get the strongest urge to stop and retie one of my shoelaces, which wasn't loose enough to be floppy. I just didn't like how it was tied. 2 seconds later, an absolutely monstrous branch, easily spanning 10 or so meters and thick as anything, came crashing down right on the path in front of us and missing us by mere meters. If I hadn't stopped to tie my shoelace, we most definitely would have been crushed by that massive branch and killed, or at the least, severely injured. Story 96. Last year, I've been visiting Japan with my friends. At end of our trip, we were organizing a bus ride back to Tokyo's airport. We managed to get tickets, and as we moved out, I had a gut feeling something ain't right. I checked out my plane boarding pass. It was one day earlier than we thought. I told others around it, and turned out 2 more people had same problem. We had to rebook autobus ride to be on time. If I wouldn't notice it, we would be ducked when we would learn at airport that we missed our fly. Story 97. I went on a date with a cute guy who lived in my apartment complex. Overall, the date was good. He was funny, snarky, and intelligent, but there was still something off. At the end of the night, I declined when he asked to come in and never responded to him again. A few months later, he was arrested on several counts of attempted murder. All the victims were in my apartment complex and the complex across the road. During this time frame, he broke into my friend's apartment while she was out at the bar. She came home drunk and saw her back door had been kicked in and immediately called her deed to come back and get her. He also tried to break into my apartment, but couldn't get the screen off my bedroom window. Fortunately, I was out of town when he tried. Story 98. I have a really bad habit of driving on the left lane when it's late at night, but one night, my gut feeling told me to drive on the right. I work closing shifts, so the one-way traffic highway I take is usually empty by that time. Except that one night, I was riding the right lane and suddenly a car zoomed past by me on the left lane. It sort of left me confused until I realized that this is a one-way highway. I later found out that same car eventually crashed into another and left them in critical condition. Not really a trust your gut, but it's strange and weird that I decided to not ride the left lane that day. Story 99. Once when I was a teenager, this girl I had issues with suddenly wanted to hang out and smoke with me and a mutual friend. She insisted we walk to the back of a graveyard. I had the strongest, most sickest feeling in my stomach that I couldn't shake. I made up excuses why I had to leave while she kept pressuring me, being extremely insistent, but I refused to give in and left. Mutual friend told me later that turns out this other girl was waiting for me back there with 3 people, prepared to jump me and stab me, all just because she was jealous her ugly-ass loser boyfriend had a crush on me. Needless to say, I'm incredibly relieved I trusted my gut, and anytime I get that feeling again, I listen to it.